I'm going to take you on the process where I'm learning how to use the lace carriage with DesignaKnit and my SK840. So I made a video a few weeks ago on how to hand manipulate this lace hem, and I tried to duplicate it with the lace carriage, but it took me a week or two to even learn how to use the lace carriage because it's a very tricky, picky carriage to use. But I'm learning all the troubleshooting and learning how to use DesignaKnit. So I'm going to show some simple videos on my computer how I set this pattern up to duplicate what I did manually. And the only thing I can't duplicate is the garter stitch. I have to hand manipulate that. But my first try, or this is probably not my first try, but I didn't put the eyelets in the right place, and I didn't do a garter stitch row, but it came out pretty well other than me not lining up the pattern repeats correctly. On this one, I did a little bit better job of shifting the pattern and making it centered on my 50 stitches, and even the edges I was able to manage those, and I'm going to show how I did that in the software. But the difference between this one and my original hand manipulated one, I did do the garter stitch divider line here by hand manipulation, but I didn't do a garter stitch after the E-wrap cast on. So I'm going to take you on what I've learned so far from casting on to the lace carriage to using the DesignaKnit software. I'm not an expert on the software because I'm not reading the manual. I'm going online and finding bits and pieces on YouTube, trying to figure out things, and then I have to make it work for what I'm trying to do. So there may be other ways, probably better ways to do it than what I'm going to show you, but this is a learning process for me, so I'm just going to show you what I've learned so far. All right, I have upgraded my DesignaKnit 8 to DesignaKnit 9 because DesignaKnit 9 includes the lace drawing tool, which is over here on the left, and it also interacts with your electronic machine and selects needles for you. I had the previous version and I did not purchase the lace module because I did not have a lace carriage, but I found one at a good price on eBay. And so now I have the lace carriage, and to get the most use out of it, I upgraded my software. All right, so I'm going to use the Stitch Designer module, or the part of DesignaKnit. So if you're just opening the software from the beginning, just choose the Stitch Designer mode. And I'm hoping this computer screen shows okay, but I'm going to try to tell you where I'm clicking all the time. So I'm going to go to File, New Pattern Setup, and I just want to make a little small stitch pattern that I can use over and over again with other shapes. But for now, we want to make sure we go to Change Method, Knitting Method. You can also change that later if you forget. I'm going to choose wrong side facing textures. There's all kind of choices here. It usually opens up with Fair Isle, and make sure you've got your knitting machine chosen and click OK. On the new pattern, new stitch pattern size, I'm going to say set the size manually, and I'm going to choose 13 stitches and 4 rows. And click OK. And this is where you go if you want to set it from a sweater pattern piece. You would choose set the size from a pattern piece. You would go into the folder and choose your sweater and choose whether you want the front, back, sleeves, whatever. And that will show up on your screen. So right now it's 13 stitches and 4 rows, and tensions don't matter. So I'm just going to say OK. Here's my little working area here. So on the lace tool, if you hold your left mouse button down, that's where your first eyelet is going to be. If you just drag to the left, it's going to transfer that stitch to the adjacent needle. So there'll be 2 stitches here, and then you'll have your eyelet on your knitted fabric. But I want to transfer a lot of stitches over by one needle. So if you were using them, it's the same as using a multi-prong tool like I showed in the in that manually knitted piece, you just pick them up on a transfer tool and move them over by one needle. And so I'm just going to drag over 6 spaces. So what these symbols mean is that each one of these needles are getting transferred over by one. It's empty in this needle, and by the time it gets here, it's going to have 2 stitches on that needle, because we're going to borrow from these stitches over here. So in the next row, I want them to go in the opposite direction, but I want this column of stitches right here in the middle to all be transferred where they're doubled up. So I'm just going to repeat those first 2 rows. All right, so I'm going to save my little piece here, save as, and I'm just going to overwrite something I already have. You can name it whatever you want. And now I want to knit a swatch, and I want it bigger than this, and I don't want to use a sweater pattern, so I'm going to stay in Stitch Designer and say, do the whole thing over again. File, new pattern setup. I am going to set the size manually this time, and I'm going to choose, just try 51 stitches, and I'm just going to put a bunch of rows in there. We don't need 40 rows, but I'm just going to choose 51 stitches by 40 rows. Same thing we did before. I'm setting the size manually. I'm making sure it says the right knitting machine, the right knitting method at the top, and I'm clicking OK. Tensions don't matter, so I'm going to say OK. So here's my 51 stitch pattern swatch, and it could be a front of a sweater, a sleeve, whatever at this point. So I'll go back to edit this time, and I'm going to import that little file that we just made, and I'm going to import it. You can do a single motif and just copy and paste it all over your pattern wherever you want it, or you can choose any of these others. I haven't played with any of these others, so this is a learning process for me, so I'm just showing you what I've done so far. So I'm choosing the horizontal border, choosing my little stitch pattern, gives me a little picture of it here to make sure I'm choosing the right one, and I'm going to say OK. All right. Everything looks good. It looks like it's centered pretty well on the pattern. This is kind of confuses me a little. If you start dragging these, you may mess up where the eyelets fall or whatever, but you can separate things out and move them around on the pattern. But right here is your, I think, where you move the whole thing. I might be wrong. You can just start dragging it, and when you do that, it changes the knitting sequence of the pattern. So I think you can move it to the side also. Yes, you can. I don't like to mess with that too much if it looks okay, because I can fix the stitches later. All right, so I'm just going to press enter, and that kind of fixes it on there. It's still got a little white box around it, so at this point I can click the copy, a little camera up there. I want to say extract the stitch symbols. You got 2 choices here. Extract the stitch symbols and copy them to the clipboard and say OK. So now they're in the clipboard. I can paste them using this paste tool. So they show up here at the top with just a little dotted line around them, and I can drag it wherever I want it, but I'm just going to set it on top of what we've just done, and that gives me an extra copy to make my little scallops a little bit deeper. But there's a lot of cleaning up we got to do, because you can't have just all these transfers. You have to have an eyelet somewhere that the transfers come from. So the program's going to, give you an error message when you do the little check procedure on it, or when you get ready to save the file. But if I followed this around, there should be an eyelet over here somewhere, but it doesn't have it. And also, when I'm knitting, I don't want these transfers and all these eyelets this close to the edge, so I do want a couple of stitches on either side to be stockinette. So there's a couple of things I can do. I can use the pencil tool and then just go over to my symbols here and choose a stockinette and just draw over it. I can also manipulate where the eyelets are. Let me just show you what happens when you can either go check here, or you can actually hit this little check button and just hit this button here, and it's telling me that I have an invalid sequence of lace symbols at row 1. So it's only telling me the first error that it found. But if I kept trying to save it, it's going to keep telling me about these others. All right. So I know I don't want an eyelet there, and these are transferring to the right. So I can play with this and go back to my lace tool. Oops. I didn't save that. Let me paste that again and drag it down. It's still in the clipboard, so what happened was it still has the little dotted line on there. So if I choose another tool, it's not actually pasted in there yet. I have to click away from it, and now it's there permanently. All right, that was a good mistake to show. So I'm going to go back to the lace tool this time, and I'm going to try to make the transfers. I mean, if I wanted a lace eyelet right here close to my seam, I could just drag over and make it a little bit shorter like that. But if you try to visualize this, if I were seaming this, one of these stockinette stitches on the edge is going to be part of my seam. So these little eyelets are going to be right close to my seam. So if you're doing a back and a front or whatever, you may want that eyelet there so the pattern repeats correctly onto the next pattern, but you may not want it. So what I would do would be to get rid of it completely if I don't want it at all. Trying to think if I do want it. I think I will keep it. Let's do just a little short one just for the sake of doing this. And I can do the same thing on the other side. See, there's no eyelet associated with these transfers, so that is not correct. So I've got this one with 2 little transfers. So these are leaning to the left, so I'm going to drag to the left. So that looks pretty good. I've got 3 empty stitches here on this side and 4 on the other. So I don't have an even number, but it's going to look okay. All right, so I've got nice little columns going on here. I'm just studying my pattern. So now I can do a check again. And what you're going to check is on the none. And let's see, row colors, floats. I'm just going to say check for color changes. No errors found. I don't know what happens when you do that. Check once. No errors found. Some of that I don't know what it means. I think it's mostly for Fair Isle. Okay, so now this little swatch is ready for me to knit, but I'm going to go ahead and save it as 001 scallop swatch. So I need to go ahead and cast on 51 stitches to my knitting machine, and then we'll come back to the software to do the interactive knitting. I'm just going to show you a few things on the lace carriage. You got your P and the L, and those are your lace settings. The P will transfer stitches without yarn in the carriage, and the L will actually transfer and knit at the same time. So for for the casting on, we need our carriage to be set on this stockinette setting, which is 0. The N on the other side will get your carriage across the bed without knitting. But in no case ever on this carriage can you have your needles in C or in D, because it will not work. It'll break the needles. Crazy things will happen. You'll get all jammed up. Alright, so I do a version of the cast on the same one that I do on the LK150 with a cast on comb or some weights or something like that. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and try to get 51 needles, because that's my swatch that I set up. I'm going to try to get them as close to B as possible. They're going to be a little bit wonky. I need 25 on that side and 26 on that side. So as long as they're not all the way back in A, I can kind of watch where the needles are going. I want them to go into this little gap in here. And if they're too far forward or too far back, If they're too far back, it'll push them all the way back to A. And I'm just going to try to line them up carefully, watching where they're going in. And there's no yarn in my carriage. So then I'm going to push these all back, every other needle back to A. That was just to help me get the needles. It's easier to pull them all out than just try to do them one by one. So everything's set to do in every other needle weaving kind of cast on. The other important thing is with this machine, you must always pull up the slack at the back on the tension mask, because there's a little brush underneath that it can get wound around when it forms a loop, because that little floating yarn guide, I'll try to pass over really slowly so you can see, when you're going in the left to right direction, that little floating thing goes all the way to the right, but it's holding the yarn at a certain length, and it's not quite knitting like a regular carriage does. And I'll show you later how it can get wound around that wheel on the bottom. There's a little brush underneath, and so now that I've got these every other loops on here, it gives me some big loops to hang a weight on. So I'm going to try to center this really heavy weight on those loops, and then add a few more weights on the edges. The lace carriage likes a lot of weight. I'm not worried about this catching on that loop on the side. It's not going to bother me. So now I can pull the rest of those needles to meet up with the others in B, just making sure that, again, that they're going to go into that right area on the carriage. So I'm real careful with the first couple of rows. And when I first got the carriage, I was tempted at times when I saw a problem going on, I'd say, oh, I'll just pull that needle out. And that was just habit, and it was a wrong thing to do with this carriage. You can never pull the needles in those other two positions. So I'm going to go ahead and knit quite a few rows with this waste yarn, because eventually I want my weights to be hanging on the top of my river. My machine is tilted back because I have it on a table and not a tilt stand, so that puts the weight at an angle that the lace carriage doesn't like. So even the manual will tell you to put your weights over here in the front so that the knitting is at a better angle in relation to the main bed. Alright, you're going to want to move your weights pretty often. I don't like to have them too close up there because you get a little bit better pull down if you have it farther away. If you put them up close, it tends to not do as well, and then it interferes with the carriage. So I move it, at least the side weights, pretty often, and making sure they're not hung up on my riverbed here where the weights aren't doing their job. I'm always checking to see if I've got some pull down going on. There's a lot of things with the lace carriage you have to watch every single time. If you try to pass the carriage across with no yarn in the carriage on the stockinette setting or the L setting, you're going to drop stitches. So when you're doing fashion lace and you're constantly changing back from the P setting to the L setting, always double check everything. Check your cam lever before you pass the carriage. If it's on L, make sure you have yarn in the carriage. If it's on P, make sure you don't have yarn. So we're going to do this whole scallop pattern, and I'm going to show all of that. Again, the lace carriage takes a lot of practice, and I've dropped a lot of stitches, and I'm like, what setting did I ignore? You know, you have to check yourself constantly. So okay, now that I've got the waste yarn on here, I want to do a closed cast on. You can choose whatever you want. I'm just going to do a double E-wrap, because the double E-wrap is going to help me to get my stitches back in, my needles back into the B position. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this waste yarn. You can do whatever closed cast on you like. And for this, I will move all the needles out to the forward position because it's easier to do the E-wrap that way for me. So I like to put my carriage on, put my yarn in the carriage, just kind of helps me hold it out of the way. Put a little pin on there, and I'm going to just start E-wrapping. I E-wrap the first needle, then I'm going to go around 2 needles over to the left into the hook of that first needle and pull it back to B position. And then I'm going to continue going over 2 needles into the hook and back to B. So I'm going to finish this E-wrap and I'll be right back. Okay, I could have planned this with my my waist yarn with the carriage on the left and then E-wrapping from the right and then knitting once back to the beginning. Because my carriage for the pattern repeats that I'm doing on the screen, it's going to make sure that my carriage starts on the right when I start the interactive knitting. So I could have planned this to where I don't have to have 2 rows. I don't like to start the transfers on the E-wrap. You can go ahead and start your interactive knitting right now. I don't like to. But in order to end up with my carriage back on the right, I'm going to have to knit off the E-wrap and then knit back. I can reform those stitches to a garter stitch like my sweater that I knit, but I'm not going to worry about it for this swatch. So for now, I'm just going to knit 2 rows just so I can get my carriage back on the right, and I'm going to line up these needles, making sure that they're going to go into the right area, because I have done the E-wrap before and it pulled a needle back to A and it looped up my E-wrap and all that. So make sure they're in good alignment with your carriage. And this is one thing that I want to point out with, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bump the camera. Let's see if I can zoom in as the carriage goes across. So I don't know if it's this yarn or whatever, but there's a round brush in the middle of the sinker plate. I'm going to try to get this more into the camera. There's a round brush right here. Right under here in the middle, there's a round brush. And if this yarn ends up below that brush, it wants to wind up around the brush. So when I start getting into the knitting area, I start feeling my carriage not wanting to move. And in the past, I would continue trying to knit and it would just tie up that around that wheel and I couldn't move the carriage. I'd have to reach in with scissors and cut it. So I like to make sure that that yarn is sitting on top of the brush. I seem to have better results with that yarn on top of the brush, and I think that's the way it's supposed to be. But if you did not pull up the slack on your yarn, like I mentioned is important at the tension mask, that's going to cause that loop to fall below that brush and then start getting wound around. So if that happens, stop, reach under there with a tool and just unwind it from that brush. You could take the sinker plate off, but then you have to start the whole cast on again. I don't want to do that. So I found a way. I've jammed up a few times and I found a way just to get it off of that wheel, pull up the slack on your yarn, and then you can continue knitting. So maybe that problem will happen while we're doing this project, but then I can show you what I do, maybe keep some of the troubleshooting stuff in there. So there's my first row of knitting next to my E-wrap, and I'm just going to knit back to the other side. And now we're ready to go to the computer and get ready to knit. So if you don't want these extra rows in there, just plan your cast on to where your carriage ends up to where the interactive knitting wants it to be. And my swatch file is still open. If yours is not, go ahead and open the one we created. And so all I have to do now is go to interactive knitting, and it's going to give me some instructions. So I have to go down here where it says browse stitch patterns, and it's usually the last one you played with. So my stitch pattern is already selected. I'm just going to click OK. You don't want to choose a shape file for this exercise because this is what I'm doing right now. So choose the stitch pattern and click OK. So now it's asking me what size I want my swatch to be, and it's telling me the stitch pattern that I'm doing is 51 stitches by 40 rows because that's the stitch pattern I just saved. So if this says something different, you can change your swatch size here, but I'm just going to leave it at 51 by 40 and click OK. It's giving me some little chirps, and it says see ready instruction, change to lace carriage, set the carriage to transfer only. So I'm going to switch to the video in a minute over my knitting machine, and I'm going to change the carriage to this, what it's telling me to do. But also on the right, you'll see the little pink carriage that's telling me that you have to start on the right. This is going to turn to a different color. I'm just going to go through the steps here. Right now, it's going to do a lot of transfers. In order to get each of these transfers by one needle, it has to pass, the carriage has to pass twice because it can only transfer in one direction. So when you pass the carriage in one direction, it's not going to do anything. But on the next pass, it's going to do one set of transfers. And your eyelet's going to move along the machine until it finally lands where it's supposed to. So it's going to take probably 10 passes of the carriage to finally get this eyelet in the right position. So it's still, to me, easier than hand manipulation, but it is a lot of movements of the carriage. So we only really have 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 rows to do, but as long as this carriage is in pink, nothing is advancing. There's no yarn being used. Your knitting is not getting any larger or anything like that. It only advances when we have yarn in the carriage for the lace setting. So let me just advance through the pattern. So on that row, it just goes to the other side, back, forth, back and forth. And it's telling you how many more rows you have to leave it in that setting. So when it gets to the setting where we have to add yarn to the carriage, this is going to be blue, and it's going to tell me to set my carriage to transfer plus knit, which is the L setting on our lace carriage for the 840. So this is the instructions that I'm going to be following when you're watching me on the video. So let me get this back to the beginning of my lace pattern, and then we'll get ready to follow the rest of the instructions. I'm going to press this ready to receive instructions for casting on, and I've already done the cast on, so I don't need to do that. I like to do the cast on before I go to the computer. So it's telling me to cast on how many stitches. I think I cast on 26 stitches on the left and 25 on the right. But I can put my cam levers where I need them to be. So I can click OK. And it's going to tell me where to put my point cams. So I'm going to say OK. And don't pass your carriage at this point with it's in the P or the L until the DesignaKnit says knitting, because it's going to try to just pick up all of those needles, especially in the L setting. So there's been times when I forgot to hit the ready button and I started to pass the carriage in the L setting, and it's trying to lift up every single needle. And I didn't break anything, but it's just kind of scary when it does that. So make sure it says knitting and that your carriage is ready. So now we're going to head on over to the knitting machine. As per the instructions on my screen, I'm going to set my cam levers, my point cams, but I'm going to do it according to what I have cast on here. And then it tells me to set the carriage to transfer only, so I'm going to remove the yarn and clip it to the side of my knitting machine to keep it completely out of the way. And I'm going to change the cam lever on my knitting machine to the P setting, so I can now check I don't have yarn in here. I've got it on P. I can safely pass the carriage without it dropping my knitting, and I'm going to just knit to the left. And nothing should happen on this one. The needles are moving, but there's really nothing being transferred because it's trying to get my carriage over into position. So this always confused me when I was trying to learn how the lace carriage works, is why is nothing happening? And then when I pass again to, because it's telling me to stay in this position for 11 more rows with this setting. So on this side, you should hear some clicking where it's transferring some stitches. And this is the other thing that always confused me, is now there's some eyelets and I'm like, well, they're not in the right position, but they're not in their final resting place at this time because it's going through the process of transferring the needles one by one. And I can see the doubled up stitches here, so it's transferring them that way. And so right here you see this stitch over here. Right now the eyelet is on needle number 22, I think. So this pass, there's going to be nothing happening. It's just getting my carriage over to the right position. This pass, there should be another transfer happen. So now that eyelet has moved over to needle number 23. And my carriage is still in the P setting because the program has not told me to change yet. Alright, it's chirping and it's letting me know that it's time to do something different, and I can compare my stitches or my eyelets to the screen to make sure that they are where they're supposed to be. And mine is a little bit different because I put my cam levers over one because I cast on the wrong number of stitches on that side, but I'm not worried about that. It's gonna turn out okay if I don't mess with anything. So at this point I'm gonna put the yarn back in the carriage, make sure it clicks all the way into that little carrier, and I'm running my hand under this yarn to make sure it's smooth, pulling up the slack. Never forget to pull up the slack, and never forget to put your carriage in L. So read the screen, come back and check your settings, and then start slowly passing the carriage across and making sure that yarn is not doing crazy stuff in there. I've gemmed up more times than I want to remember. So that just was it knitted all of those eyelets. I don't think any transfers were done, but the program knows what I've got designed in there. So I only knit once. I've only advanced one row. So now it's telling me again, it chirped over there and it's telling me my carriage is on the left. I should change my carriage to transfer only. So I'm kind of jiggle my carriage over a little bit to get that little floating carrier. I can't show you because my camera's in the wrong place. But if that little floating yarn carrier is in the wrong place, you can just kind of jiggle your carriage back and forth so that so you can get the yarn out. So I've taken the yarn out, I'm clipping it on the left side of my machine, I'm changing my cam to P, and then I start the transfers. This row's not going to do anything. The next row should. So you see my original 4 eyelets on here. I don't know how well you can see at this angle. Now it's going to do some transfers. And I've got some extra eyelets going on here. The first few times I used my lace carriage, I thought I had dropped stitches and it was driving me crazy. But again, you have to remember they're not where they're supposed to be at this time, but that's fine. So I've got these extra holes going on. This time it's not going to do anything. And then now it's going to do some more transfers back and forth, just like we did on the previous thing. So we're going to do this about 7 more rows. And then it's going to tell me to change to the lace setting, and the whole process is going to repeat for all 8 rows, and you've got all these passes of the carriage, and we're going to only end up with 8 rows knitted. And just do a slow pace, don't try to knit real fast. And usually you need both hands on the carriage, but it's kind of hard with the camera in my way. See, I can tell the eyelet is almost where it needs to go. And now it's time for me to change the carriage. So I'm going to put it back on the L, load up the yarn, pull up the slack, and keep going. So I'll meet you back when I've got a few more rows done. I wanted to show you what I'm seeing down in here. I can see that my yarn under here, I don't know if you can see my finger here, but that yarn is getting caught on that wheel. So I'm going to fix that before I push the carriage any farther. And if I have to, I think it's just the yarn I'm using. This is just some waste yarn that I purchased for my sock machine. And it's a little bit sticky. It's a cheap yarn, but it's good for practicing on. I did some other yarn that didn't hang up like this on that brush, but I want to get it out from around that brush because the brush is grabbing that yarn and wanting to wind it around. So that's why every time I'm on a knit row with the lace, I'm looking down, I'm watching this looping going on, and here's where the needles are fixing to interact, and this little carrier is going to carry my yarn across to the first needle. And if I wouldn't have pulled that out, it probably would have jammed up. So that's why every time I switch over to the lace setting, I always like to look down in there and make sure that it's not winding around that wheel, that brush. So I'm going to continue knitting now. Everything seems fine, and then I'll return. I want to show you what happens if you accidentally knit too many rows. You get into the zone and you're just transferring stitches back and forth in the P setting, and you're knitting so fast that you're not giving the program time to chirp at you and let you know it's time to do something different. I try to look at the screen every 2 rows when my carriage is back on the side where my yarn is parked. I like to just kind of glance at the screen and see if the carriage is still pink or if it's still blue on the screen, and so it kind of gives me a chance. But if you kind of pause every time you get to the end of a row, you'll give the program time to catch up to give you the commands. But I want to show you what happens and what you do if you've missed a command. So I'm in the P setting, so there's no yarn in my carriage, so I'm just doing transfers right now. So I'm just knitting along, just getting into the zone, not paying attention. So it's telling me to change, but let's say I just wasn't paying attention and I went across with no yarn. Now I'm going to have to go to the computer program and do something to get my carriage back to the other side. So at this point I'm going to switch back to the computer screen and I'll show you what to do. So right now my machine is still in the knitting mode. That means the program is interacting with my carriage. So I like to do it this way. First, my carriage is on the right, but it needs to be on the left so I can grab that yarn, change to the L setting. So I'm gonna, without moving my carriage at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and just hit this back button right here. It'll go back to the previous row where I should have changed, or you can go back as many rows as you need to. But I just messed up 1 row, so I'm going to go back 1 row, and when I do, it's going to stop the knitting and it's going to give me some instructions all over again. So what I'm going to do now, it shows my carriage should be on the left and it's still on the right. So I'm going to put my carriage on the the end setting on the cam lever. You can't see what I'm doing. And I'm going to pass the carriage to the left. And then I'm going to restart the interactive knitting here, just like I did in the beginning. It's showing me at row 77, which I'm not really paying attention to my row counter. You should, so that you'll know exactly where you are. And then I'll hit the ready button just like at the beginning. It's telling me I should be at row 77. Place the carriage at the left. It gives you a chance to do all that before you click on anything else. Click OK. And now it's going to start the knitting all over again as far as where it's currently located. Click OK. And now it says knitting. So now I can change my carriage to the L setting. I can load up my yarn, pull up the slack, and continue knitting. Okay, here's where I recovered. I've got my carriage now doing what it should do, and I'm just going to knit across. And so the program's telling me now I should change back to the P setting. I have 2 more repeats left to do, so I'm going to put the carriage back on the P and continue what we've been doing. Take the yarn out of the carriage and repeat the process over and over again till all of my transfers have been done. Okay, I'm not going to finish the pattern because I think I've shown all of the troubleshooting things that I've come across in learning how to use this carriage. But when you get finished, you should end up with something like this if you have not put your little garter stitches in, although my placement of the pattern is not quite like this. I've got the eyelets going on each edge, and so it's centered a little bit differently on mine. And again, this is the one that I added the garter stitch row in, which I like a lot. So I hope this helps in getting you started with the DesignaKnit with your SK840 and the lace module. I had a lot of confusion. There's not a lot of videos using the electronic SK840 with DesignaKnit, especially for lace. I've seen a lot using the EC1. In the back of my manual, it gives me instructions for the EC1, but I don't have one. Those aren't being made anymore, and you have to use pattern cards and all that kind of stuff. So the DesignaKnit's the best way to go. And you also have to have the Silverlink. The Silverlink, this one's the Silverlink 5, and that's the current model, I think. And I purchased this with my machine so that I could do Fair Isle and tuck stitches and things like that. But you also have to have it to do the lace carriage.